Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm coming from behind, sorry for that. Thanks for joining us here at the GCF Pavilion, the GCF-GEF Pavilion. My name is Andreas Reumann. I'm currently acting head of the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. So again, we're very pleased to be able to do this not virtually, but as a hybrid event. So we do it here in person with the audience and with a couple of its esteemed colleagues virtually that will be talking about what we know and what we don't know about the private sector and what sort of lessons we have drawn from evaluating the private sector in the recent past. So first, let me just briefly walk you through and say a few words on the event before we start with a very brief introductions of what we've been finding and what we've been learning. And then we hope to open up very quickly to a very insightful and hopefully a very interactive discussion. And we've changed slightly our format today. So we are having in the beginning a couple of presentations, and we also do have two discussants that are sitting here on stage. So we have on the one hand, we have an esteemed colleague from the German Institute of Evaluation, of Development Evaluation, Sven Harten, who is the deputy director there. And next to him, we have Margaret Ann Splam from the executive director from Climate Markets Investment Association, which is also, and she's also the private sector observer of the Green Climate Fund in many of her other positions that she's holding. So lastly, here on stage, we've also got Archi Rastogi, Dr. Archi Rastogi, who is the evaluation advisor here at the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. He's also here today to talk about a couple of evaluations that we have done, but most recently and most importantly, the evaluation of the private sector approach of the Green Climate Fund. So again, apologies. Again, let me also introduce very briefly our panelists that have joined us virtually. You cannot see them right now, but you will see them when they start presenting. So the first panelist that we have is Mrs. Véronique Salze-Lozac'h. She has joined the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, as the chief evaluator on 1st of June 2021. In this position, she is responsible for delivering high-quality independent evaluations that enhance the EBRD accountability and provide evidence-based lessons for better results. She is an economist with a strong evaluation background and over 30 years of experience working for both public and private sector on inclusive growth, private sector development, policy reforms in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Prior to EBRD, she was the Deputy Director General of the Independent Evaluation Department of the Asian Development Bank. And prior to that, she was also the Chief Economist of the Asia Foundation. So we're very pleased to have her joining us virtually today. The second panelist that joins us virtually is Mr. Nathan Subramaniam. He is the Director of the Independent Evaluation Sector and Project Division, the IESP of the Independent Evaluation Department of the Asian Development Bank. In his current role, he's part of the leadership team that oversees the evaluations of sector and project evaluations, validations, in particular in the sectors of energy, transport, water, urban, finance, agriculture and natural resources, and all private sector operations. He has 23 years of working experience and about 13 years spent at ADB in various areas of the independent evaluation and capital markets investment sections. He is also joined by his colleague, Mr. Garrett Kilroy. He's a senior evaluation specialist at the Independent Evaluation Department of the Asian Development Bank. So we're also very pleased to have him here with his 20 years of experience in working in water resources, environment, climate change evaluations, and institutions in Europe, Asia, and Asia. And that would be the panel for today. I hope we have a very insightful discussion throughout this event right now. So I'll start with our own evaluation, and that is presented by Archi Rastogi, who sits just to my left. So Archi, take it away. Tell us about what we've learned and what we've recommended that should be done in order to look at private sector, active private sector approach of the GCF. Over to you.
Thank you, Andreas. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As Andreas said, I represent the independent evaluation unit of the GCF, so we don't work directly. We're not the secretariat. Instead, we report directly to the board, and our reports are provided to the board. Our evaluative reports are provided to the board with recommendations, etc. And we inform the decision-making of the board, and that's our mandate. With that mandate, last year, or earlier this year, we started this evaluation and concluded this evaluation of the GCF's approach to the private sector. And some of the findings in this evaluation are quite startling, but some of them might be quite well known and expected by at least some of us in the room. So let me start with give you very few overarching findings that we had from this evaluation. So the first one related to the role of the GCF. We find that the mandate of the GCF refers to two things. It refers to channeling of climate finance, and it refers to catalyzing climate finance. But in the strategy documents of the GCF, there is no distinction made between leverage and mobilizing on the one hand and catalyzing on the other. Now, leverage and mobilizing can be done quite immediately and can be done with different kinds of instruments. However, for catalyzing, we're proposing that the GCF might not need to take roles such as providing grants, making losses in the short term, etc., which then can and these investments can then subsequently or in the very long term create catalyzing of climate finance in contexts and sectors where the private sector may not automatically go. And this is important because, and Margaret might say this later in her interventions, that the private sector has demonstrated an interest in investing in climate positive investments. And this we know from the success of climate bonds. We know this from climate-related disclosures, etc. But the role falls upon public institutions such as the GCF with public finance to make that happen, make that jump happen, really. The second relates to the portfolio of the GCF, and the GCF portfolio has a very specific mandate to be driven by country priorities. And we find that link is still quite tentative. The portfolio that the GCF has in countries is not necessarily country-owned or country-driven, and there is an opportunity to link this portfolio better to national priorities, to priorities that are stated in the NDCs, for instance, or linking project origination better to country priorities overall. A third finding that relates to the processing of the GCF, and no surprises here, the GCF is quite slow still. It's improved quite a bit from the days when it started, but it still takes very, very long for entities to get accredited. It takes up to a median of over 750 days from start of an application to approval by the board, which is considered quite long, generally speaking, but also quite long for not suitable for the private sector. It also takes very, very long for projects to get approved, more than 220 days for projects to be submitted to board approval. And then legal negotiations follow. So these timelines are quite out of sync with the culture of private sector and are very important to get right for private sector investments. And finally, a very crucial finding for our evaluation relates to another part of the mandate of the GCF, which relates to local actors and small and medium-sized enterprises, the MSMEs. So that's one. The second part relates to focusing on vulnerable countries, including the small island developing states, the SIDS, or the least developed countries, the LDCs. So GCF private sector should focus on these vulnerable countries and the importance of adaptation in the GCF portfolio. We find that the GCF private sector portfolio is limited in all three areas. Once again, local actors, SIDS and LDCs, and adaptation. And this portfolio then needs correction as well. Our recommendations relate to these areas automatically. So we're recommending for the board to clarify whether the GCF is a catalyzing institution or a mobilizing one. We have several recommendations on the speed of the GCF, and this relates also to we keep talking about the direction of travel, whether the direction of travel is right, but it's also important to get how that travel will happen right as well. Who will take along, in what manner, at what speed, and that's also very important to get right. The third recommendation relates to country ownership, to increase planning in the country, to strengthen country planning and identify the priorities within the countries on private sector. So that's also quite important. And finally, the use of instruments, correction of the portfolio when it relates to adaptation, SIDS and LDCs. So those are the 4 areas of recommendations we're making in this evaluation. It's a very sweet, small little report, not very thick. I encourage you to download it. It's very easy to read. It was a lot of fun and challenging to write, but a lot of fun as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Archi. Colleagues, I've just realized I should have put my mask down so you can understand me much better than before. Look, Archi, very rich indeed, a very tight report, as you said, and not that many pages, but very important messages that come out here. Again, just to recap, it's far more about the catalyzing and not only the leverage. It's far more about how do we invite local actors to be part of this journey with the private sector. How we look at vulnerable countries and in particular, and as you know, that resonates with me a lot. What you said last on it's far more about how that travel happens and not only the direction of travel and whom we take with us on that journey. So thanks, very insightful. We come to the second presentation on the learnings in this space, in the climate space, in that regard, with related to the private sector. Ms. Véronique from EBRD will be introducing some of her findings. Véronique, can you hear us?
I can. I hope you can hear me. My voice is broken.
Yes.
But I'll try to make myself understandable.
Excellent. We can hear and see you as well. So really, really great to have you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting us. It's really a pleasure to be here, especially with such renowned and high-level panelists. My presentation is going to be just a few slides, and it's not on one evaluation that EBRD conducted, but it's more a knowledge product that we put together with, especially with my colleague Alper Dinser, who is also clicking for the presentations. We, I think it was in June, after I joined EBRD, about a week or 2 after I joined, we were talking about the importance of the green crisis and the fact that EBRD was taking a really strong statement to say that it will accompany this transition of the countries towards more of a green economy. And I asked my colleagues to check what type of information we had from evaluation, our evaluation from EBRD, but also evaluation from other colleagues. Before I come to that, I would like to start with this slide that just to give the context. You know, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, forecasted that to keep global warming not more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels, the type of investment that will be needed per year will be between 1.6 or almost 2 trillion to almost 4 trillion per year. That's enormous, especially when you see the blue line at the bottom of the graph, which shows the current flows, which is around 600 billion. So that gives you an idea of the huge effort and the gap that needs to be filled if we want to be able to achieve what needs to be done for our planet. So there is an urgent need to mobilize climate finance, and that cannot be done without mobilizing the private sector. So when what we did is that we looked at IFIs, international finance institutions, and the role they could play, and the lesson that we could gather from recent evaluation from independent units. And first of all, what came out of this search was, the one before, Alpa. So it was that IFIs have a very unique role to play because of their geographical presence, because of their mandate, also because they can have more leeway to take risk, and because they are also experienced in negotiating, collaborating with authorities at the national and subnational level. Those are elements that will really help mobilize private sector. Secondly, there was a big commitment from almost all IFIs and definitely from EBRD on trying to reach by 2025 a level of 50% of the annual investments or operations that could be devoted to green finance or to green activities in mitigation and adaptation. That's a very ambitious goal. And of course, the role that evaluation has to play, it's to accompany our institution, support our institution in reaching these ambitious goals. And we can do that as evaluators by making sure that we hold them accountable for the promises. And we need to do that for the financing countries, for the countries of operation, and also, of course, for the people and the beneficiaries. But it's also important for us to be able to use our function to bring evaluation knowledge so that we can learn from what works, what doesn't work. So with that in mind, we looked at more than 100 evaluations from the African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, EIB, European Investment Bank, the GCF, and we put together key lessons coming from these independent evaluations that could be of relevance and that could be very informative in the years to come. These theses you can find now online. It's really fresh. It's from today, and I would be recommending you to look at it. It's 7 pages, just extracting the key lessons from these evaluations. So the next slide, I will just summarize the key lessons that are relevant to the discussion today. IFIs are active in 3 areas when it comes to climate change. They provide finance, they help also transform markets, and they mobilize private sector finance. I'm here just focusing on the lessons coming from independent evaluation on mobilization of this private sector for climate action. The first lesson is that IFIs have an important role to play in coordinating all the efforts and bringing some coherence to all these efforts. If we look at what didn't work in the past, and there is one example from Indonesia of action after the tsunami, where there was a lot of fragmentation of donors. Everybody was bringing its own funding. There was a lot of inefficiency, effectiveness was deteriorating. So if we want to be up to the level of ambition, we have to bring this element of coherence and coordination, and IFIs are well suited to do that. The second key lesson is that IFIs have a very important role to play in promoting policy reforms and creating supportive environment for the private sector to be able to invest in climate actions, to be able to take the risk, and to be able to invest in viable, bankable, sustainable activities. And that's where IFIs have a role to play in addition to financing. The third lesson is that IFIs in the past have shown that by bringing technical assistance or technical cooperation and building the capacity of commercial banks or the capacity of financial intermediaries, they really played an important role in fostering financial innovation for climate change, where they actually help these financial intermediaries be more confident in financing energy efficiency or renewable energy. And that's something we found, for example, in an evaluation from the Inter-American Development Bank, where they showed that IDB's support to government in central and private sector in Central and South American, in Central and South America, was really important in upgrading the environment and social management system of the IFIs, and that led to better capacity to support private sector financing in climate change. And I will finish with a slide on, okay, what does that mean going forward? It means five things. First, that we need, as IFIs, we need to ensure that IFIs continue to promote collaboration and among IFIs, but also to share knowledge and share knowledge, know-how, because that's really something that's as important, if not more, as mobilizing funding. Second element is IFIs need to continue to be involved in addressing policy reforms and in creating supportive business environments for private sector investments. Third, we need to get data straight. That's really important. We found it across almost all of the evaluations. There is a deficiency in collecting the right data, especially at the output level and outcome level, and to look at results and to be able to measure how our institutions have been contributing and will be contributing to the climate change. What is important is to make sure that when we develop this data collection and that we monitor data, we also show our colleagues and partners in the private sector that it's not just a burden to collect data, that it's a win-win situation. It makes business sense to collect the right information because it can also help improving the pricing or managing the risk that are climate related. And I would finish with one lesson or recommendation going forward, and that's addressed to evaluators. So for us as independent evaluation units in IFIs, we need to be much more agile than we have been in the past. It's a crisis. We are facing a climate crisis the same way we were facing a COVID crisis. And we need to adapt our tools, our approaches, and our products to this very fast moving situation. It's new technologies, new approaches that need to be implemented and that we need to assess on a regular basis to make sure that we bring the data and the information, the findings that are requested by the private sector, by our board members, by our colleagues, to make sure that their operation and investment are going to the right place and are having the impact that we are expecting them to have. So that's the last message. It's really towards us, and it is for us to be more agile, the way we've been doing it for COVID-19, and we need to be more real, providing some real-time assessment and rapid assessment of what is going on. And I will finish that. I still have my voice. I'll be happy to answer questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Véronique. Thank you, Véronique. Excellent to have you, and obviously with a broken voice, we're even feeling much more indebted to you that you come on and did this excellent presentation. And to the audience, it's obviously a tremendous opportunity to have this soft launch here of the synthesis report done by the EBRD on that matter. Again, also these takeaways resonate very much with the GCF and the Independent Evaluation Unit, thinking about coherence and coordination. Archi has mentioned that as being one key factor for the private sector, but also thinking about the environment, the enabling environments and the innovation that are crucial to enable us, and going forward, thinking about the know-how as well as the opportunity on how to measure successes in private sector climate interventions. And lastly, of course, remaining agile to this fast-paced environment is something that we think about day and day when we try to do evaluations not only in the development space but in the climate space. That's obviously a very different context. Moving to our next presenter, to the ADB and the Asian Development Bank's learning on interactions with the private sector, I invite our virtual presenter to take us through the findings there. Over to you, Garrett.
Hi, Andreas, and thank you for that. Can I just check you can hear me and see the presentation okay?
We can hear you and see the presentation as well. Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, my name is Garrett Kilroy, and I was the team leader for our thematic evaluation on ADB support for action on climate change. And Nathan, who's on the panel, was our director overseeing this evaluation. So in this short presentation, we pulled together some of the findings from this evaluation on the private sector to share with the audience. So, right, okay, great. Just in terms of outline, just one slide on context, and then I'll get into ADB's strategy and the portfolio for private sector climate finance. I'll discuss the findings on performance and results, and then one slide on key takeaways. So in terms of context, well, actually, Véronique actually has already covered some of the data. So, and it's good that our data are the same and they match. So the data, there is a financing gap. We're quite far away from meeting that gap. When we talk about climate finance, we often talk about mobilizing finance, getting from the billions to the trillions. And the UK Chancellor this week was identifying the ways that we can look to do that. Now the MDB contribution obviously is a lot less, but as Véronique was saying, it has an important enabling role and supporting the enabling environment for the private sector and demonstrating project feasibility. The graph just shows, I've just pulled it out from a series of annual joint reports that the MDBs prepare on climate finance, just looking at the lower income and middle income economies, because that's mainly where ADB, the space that ADB operates. So, obviously we're talking about billions. It's averaging over the last 5 years about 8.4 billion per year. A little bit leveling off in recent years, and obviously in 2020 was impacted by COVID. But the main point is yeah, we have to get from billions to trillions, and the MDBs can help in that enabling context. So in terms of our strategies, well, we looked at ADB's strategies over the last decade, and throughout, the importance of the private sector was acknowledged and highlighted. And ADB has established tailored funds to support private sector engagement on climate, such as the Canadian Climate Fund, and also more recently the Australian Climate Financing Partnership. Probably the most significant guiding document for the private sector at ADB over the decade has been our 2009 energy policy, and that it's it's not surprising, and most of, you'll see in the next slides that most of the investment has gone towards renewable energy. But there hasn't really been a self-standing strategy document for the private sector, except for more recently in 2019, and that is a bit of a gap we identified. In terms of country partnership strategies, we also identified a gap in that that the pathway of engagement for the private sector is often absent in our country partnership strategies, and that's important both in terms of on the public side supporting the enabling environment, but also setting up the pipeline and an approach to support the private sector. Then also in terms of how we're set up in ADB, we have a climate risk management framework, but it's rarely used in the design of private sector investments. And that's primarily because often it comes too late. It can take a few months to prepare the climate risk assessments, which may be too slow for the private sector. But also by the time ADB gets engaged, very often the projects are already designed, or even in some cases, the infrastructure is already built. So in terms of portfolio, so I talked about the strategies. What kind of portfolio is this leading to? Well, over the evaluation period, there were 107 private sector climate tag projects, almost all in the energy sector, amounting to about 8.6 billion over the period. So that represents about 21% of overall climate finance lending over the decade, which was 40 billion overall. And in the figure, you can see that when we look at two time slices, two 5-year time slices, private sector has increased by about 23%, but not to the extent that the public sector finance has increased, which has been much higher. And as I mentioned, that the private sector operations were heavily focused on debt finance for the renewable energy sector in the larger Asian economies. And about 2/3 of our private sector climate finance was concentrated in 5 countries: India, the PRC, Thailand, Indonesia, and Pakistan. So a bit more detail on where the money has been going. As it says, it's concentrated in the energy sector, and the graph shows the subsectors that we've been operating in. So the renewables, solar, wind, hydropower, but also finance, geothermal, urban public transport, money and capital markets, sort of support for green bonds, transmission and distribution. Common to many MDBs, we've been struggling to get adaptation investments through the private sector portfolio. There are some sort of green shoots in recent years in areas like building green buildings in India, for example. So in terms of performance and results, the portfolio is not very mature, but for the closed and validated projects that we do have, the private sector climate investments have performed quite well with a success rate of 70%, which is higher than the average for private sector over the period. The focus was on mitigation through the expansion of renewable energy. And there is no doubt that ADB, along with other MDBs, has been playing a key role in demonstrating the feasibility of the technologies, and particularly in the renewable energy sector. In terms of results, obviously, given the investments and the focus on renewable energy, it's mainly through greenhouse gas reductions that the results that we're getting. And also more recently, we're starting to see stronger engagement in ADB between the public sector and the private sector, particularly working upstream to support the standards and regulations and enabling environment for private sector to get more engaged. There was also some financial support for non-traditional instruments, such as green bonds in Thailand and in the Philippines. So just some key takeaways, and these are kind of extracted from our recommendations. But really, yeah, what we see very positive signals when the public sector and the private sector work together, particularly if we can get the sequencing right in terms of supporting, for example, PPP laws, regulations, standards to make the environment more attractive to private sector investments. At the country level, there is a clear need that private sector considerations need to be better integrated into those strategies so that the programming can be more sequenced and support private sector engagement. We also need to look for opportunities to work upstream and embed climate risk assessments in the private sector operations. And we also need to look at opportunities beyond straight debt finance, including, for example, credit enhancement products and green bonds. And we do need to look for opportunities for support for adaptation and the demand side energy efficiency, like the green buildings that I mentioned. So I'll stop there and There are more information on the website for this evaluation, and happy to take any questions, and as I'm sure Nathan will as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Garrett. Thanks for this insightful presentation on the ADB's take on the private sector. Look, I think, colleagues, I think we've heard enough of from the evaluation front. Let's see. I think again a takeaway here was, and Garrett illustrated that quite nicely. It's all about how can the MDBs come to that enabling role that they should be taken. Collaboration seems to be key. We've been hearing this from Véronique, we've been hearing this from Archie, and now also from Garrett. Integration upstream is a very interesting idea. We've also heard that instruments matter. We need to go beyond debt finance when we think about private sector. So that's all very good. One thing that we hear a lot when we here at the GCF are talking to our country representatives, we hear repeatedly that, and it's repeatedly highlighted that context matters. And there's no room for only having one-size-fits-all solutions. And so I wonder, Margaret, I wonder, coming to you, representing the private sector here in one person, I don't think that's possible, but maybe really getting the discussion, coming to the discussion and getting the discussion rolling here, what would you say is the context of the private sector, listening into all the evaluators here and that have presented before, but also knowing that you speak to the private sector in different countries and different contexts. So just tell us a little bit of what we might be missing.
Thank you so much, Andreas, and thanks for inviting me here today. And Archie, your report was fantastic. It was very well done, and it was really interesting to hear from EBRD as well as ADB. So yes, I sit in as the active private sector observer representing the developed nations constituency at the Green Climate Fund. And for those that don't know what that means that I actually get to intervene on behalf of the private sector and participate in board meetings or other activities that they have. And to do that is I work with the association, which is an accredited observer organization, which is called the Climate Markets and Investment Association. We are a nonprofit trade association, and we are representing a coalition of private sector actors to mobilize the trillions needed to enable a transition to a climate resilient and low carbon sustainable economy. So I'd like to give you a bit of context, because I think this is important to give the context when we're talking about GCF is the context of the private sector, because what CMIA does, so the Climate Markets and Investment Association, is really we act as a conduit and a single focused voice of expertise for information flow between business communities and climate funds. We have a long history as observer to the Green Climate Fund since inception, but also at the other climate funds. So for example, we're the representative at the World Bank Climate Investment Funds, which is an $8.6 billion fund held in trust at the World Bank. We represent there through the Clean Technology Fund. Prior to that, we were at the Forest Investment Program, and we were also the private sector observer at the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. So we've got a lot of deep institutional knowledge of understanding what the funds is. But for the average private sector or the average business community, it's a really tricky animal to, an animal is not maybe the right word, but it's very tricky and difficult to understand what that means. Now, our members represent really the top of their field, so that is to say from Camco Clean Energy, which is a climate and impact fund manager and also an accredited entity at the GCF, to the lawyers that write contracts for renewable energy or carbon, such as DLA Piper, Baker McKenzie. We also have project developers on the ground who do carbon projects or water projects like Alcott and Vita, as well as technical experts such as Limited that assists often accredited entities at writing the funding proposals. And why I mention all of this is that collectively we gather the insight and information. We have to understand the context of the fund. The governance of the fund matters. We understand that, and we can't make recommendations that go against the very, the way that the fund is governed. But understanding that and then trying to fit that in is I've spoken with him before, is like fitting a round peg into a square hole, because for the average private sector entity, it's very difficult to understand. It's very cumbersome. The processes are very long, and Archie mentioned this about the accreditation process, but also about the funding proposal. The private sector, it's very hard to understand why it takes so long to get money out of the GCF, and particularly very difficult to understand the processes, the procedures, the long accreditation time, the time delays, and even once you, let's say, get funding approval, you've got this whole other subsequent legal accreditation master agreement that needs to be signed, which is very difficult for an average private sector company. So I think I could maybe stop there just to give a bit of context, but what I'm saying is that for me to do this, I reach out to a lot of the accredited entities. There's only private sector only represents 20% of the accredited entities. We represent around 30% of total funding that's given. It's a long and an arduous road for a private sector company to do that, to want to undertake that. And one final point that I'd like to make is that no private sector entity comes there and is able to do this alone. So they have to hire consultants to help them write the funding proposal. They have to hire, greenhouse gas experts. They have to hire a bunch of other people. And the private sector is not, somehow there's this expectation that that the private sector should somehow be climate experts. And we just can't be, and it's just impossible to meet the expertise or the level of what's required from the GCF. So when you have that with companies that have deep pockets, when you filter that down into what the Green Climate Fund wants, which is more direct access entities, it becomes harder and harder as you go further and further down with SIDS or LDCs or any type of direct access entity. So we see this compounded impact of that it gets, what the GCF wants to do is in fact further away from the very entities sometimes that they want to help, but to work with the GCF to become a delivery partner of the Green Climate Fund is exceedingly difficult for a private sector entity. So I'll stop there and we can maybe follow on. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. Again, really insightful to hear this as you represent a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of varieties of different contexts and sectorial contexts for sure as well. Look, before I come back to you to just delve deeper into this question of, we've been hearing this board meeting, but also the last board meeting, we've been hearing this across from the ADB to the GCF. We are not there yet when we think about adaptation. The portfolios are mostly looking at mitigation efforts and energy efforts. What I guess would be very interesting to know a little bit is on what kind of support and how that support could be established and what sort of needs are there. But before I come to this question, we have left out one person, and that's Sven, who's at the very end here on stage at the GCF Pavilion. He's representing not necessarily the evaluators from MDBs and larger global funds. He's representing the bilateral funds that are coming and the evaluations and lessons learned that we have from that corner. So I know Sven is very critical of some of our work. So it's excellent to have him here as a panelist. Over to you, Sven, and a couple of remarks that come from your experience from DEval. Over.
Thank you, Andreas. And perhaps as a disclaimer up front, so the last 5 years I spent at DEval, which is Germany's official institute to evaluate its ODA spending. So we have sort of a specialized institute there. Before that, I spent about 7 years at the IFC. And I still do, and before that I worked in the private sector. As a small disclaimer up front, I still believe a lot in the work. I believe a lot in the work of the private sector. But it's Friday afternoon. end of the first week. We're all tired, and so let's get perhaps an interesting discussion started. And Margaret, actually, thank you for your refreshing remarks. And I must say, I was a bit afraid in the beginning when I saw the setup of the panel, because I was like, oh, you know, I don't know what you will present, but actually what I'm going to say is very much in line what you mentioned, because you know, we hear everywhere, okay, you need to get the private sector in, bring it in, and sometimes I feel like, you know, as sort of as a development climate change community, sometimes we're sort of in a bubble. And it sounds in some presentations, it sounds a bit like, yeah, well, you just pick up the call and then the private sector will come and then they will bring the trillions. But as you said, you know, it's not that easy. There are a couple of challenges. So at DEval, we did a couple of evaluations on private sector engagement. One is a synthesis of private sector engagement in development cooperation. And another one was a really large one on blended finance, specifically on structured funds. And before I come to the critical point, you know, a few positive results there as well. So in terms of structured funds, our evaluation looking at funds where Germany has a stake, mainly through KfW. Well, we saw a mobilization of 1-to-1, so $1 of public money leveraged $1 of private funding, which is nice in the very initial calculations, and at some point we came up with just a quarter, but that was sort of an internal mistake. We got really scared. So at the end, it's one-on-one, which is nice. I leave it up to you to think how that can be improved. Also on structured funds, you know, we saw it's an amazing vehicle. It works actually quite well. It's economically efficient, but for the funds that we looked at, there were two issues. So one is they went into working with financial institutions, increasing access to finance. Great goal, you know. A lot of financing for SMEs is still needed, but you know, the IFIs and IFC, for instance, where I work, they've done that for 20, 30 years. So it's not the most innovative thing to do. And also, what we saw, the most effective, successful funds, well, they went to, from a development perspective, they went to the easier countries, right? So then you wonder, okay, well, how can we push the envelope? You know, the funds that we looked at worked well, but there's sort of some question marks there. And also in another study, we found that actually in the cooperation with the private sector, very positive effects on, I think Garrett alluded to this as well, reducing emissions, and renewable energies. Now then again, perfect, that's good, but this is the stuff that it's for an evaluator, it's easy to measure, and it's perhaps not the hardest thing to achieve. You know, where's the boundary in terms of adaptation? But then again, you know, the Eco Business Fund, Green Growth Fund, they're cool vehicles that work, they achieve their results. But if we talk later about a paradigm shift, you know, transformation, those vehicles, they as they are used right now, they're not the vehicles for transformation, it appears. One area what we looked at in another evaluation on climate change adaptation, there we focused on residual risks or loss and damage. We call it residual risk because of the political debate behind it. And there we found, you know, with the insurance investment facility, with the African risk capacity, we found good instruments in terms of risk pooling and also some risk sharing, especially in terms of the climate risk insurance. So, and there's growing importance with those vehicles, but some significant challenges. And let me just take two minutes to highlight some very important ones. We heard from several of the presenters the timelines, country ownership, you know, there's a some issue with national priorities. So, for instance, if you set up a structured fund, you know, you have your constituent document for the fund, and that fund runs for 10, 20 years or longer. The newer funds have exit strategies, but the older ones don't, so they run indefinitely. So if country priorities change, well, for the fund, it's really hard to change. You know, it is possible through the governance structure, but it's a really cumbersome and long process. So it's not the vehicle, you know, to quickly change gears and respond to national priorities or to business opportunities. So one of the key recommendations from our side there was, you know, you need to simplify some of those funds. Also, the three-tier structure, well, the first loss you definitely need to keep, but then there's a mezzanine tranche and a third tranche. For some investors, this is too complicated, and some want to take more risks. So, you know, they're a vehicle that works relatively well, but it's long, slow, and quite complicated to explain. And then also some of those funds, they're set up with a geographical focus. And, you know, there's a big challenge here when, Andreas, you're talking about context, you know. Well, for risk-sharing facilities, you want to spread your risk. You want to have a sort of a really broad range of countries and different types of risks. But then again, how do you make it context specific? You know, how do you have an investment vehicle that really taps into the opportunities of a country? So that's one. I leave it sort of to the expert to design how make that more attractive. And then just to the points of Véronique, I completely agree. Also, we saw that you know, data is so important. It's really hard to evaluate those guys. You know, I mean, a structured fund. If you look at sort of the value chain until the final impacts as an evaluator, you know, where do you start and where do you end? So cooperation, coordination on getting the right data, also from financial institutions which do have a legitimate question about this disclosure and data privacy. But then again, if you really want to look at how a fund works, what it generates, you need to get some access to the data. So that's a challenge. And maybe one last thing. What we also found is that climate risk assessment, at least for Germany as bilateral donor, we don't have a good coverage on climate risk assessments. There's a new initiative from the ministry, so that's great. But as you know, experts here and as a global community, I think there's a call for coordination, working together to get the data on risk assessment, so that we can then design the right products and make them work. Thank you.
Thank you, Sven. Really rich discussion that you brought up here with lots of different points. But you know, what struck me again is this question of context does carry quite some weight. Let me put it to Véronique, since she's done and her office has done the synthesis on 102 evaluations. Just Véronique, with this diverse portfolio review, was the context a true factor in the success in the question for successful outcomes? Véronique, just from your perspective, is that where we need to be and where we need to think about good ways forward to include and to be more inclusive with the private sector? Over to you.
Yes, thank you. Definitely the context is very important. What do we mean by context? I think there are elements that are to be taken into account. The first one is the structure of the private sector in the country of operation. It's the context of the capacity of that private sector, whether it's a fragmented private sector with a lot of smaller enterprises, or whether they have big companies with more capacity to invest. That's a very important element to take into account. Second element of the context is the policy environment, as we were saying earlier, and at what level of policy reform the government is to create an environment that's stable enough and reliable enough for private sector investors to feel comfortable investing. I have to say also one of the elements of context that we need to take into account is access to information. Is how easy is it for the private sector in that country or in that sub region to access new technologies, new know-how, and to access information. There is something that actually emerged from the lessons from a few evaluations across countries. What was the importance of access to information and the disparities of access to information and knowledge by the private sector. So those maybe three elements will be the three elements I would highlight in terms of context that needs to be taken into account.
No, thanks, Véronique. This again resonates very well with what we've heard, and it's obviously very rich what you brought forward here. Look, again, the policy environment, the question of capacity and what sort of context in terms of companies and company structure you have. I may put it again to ADB because this all goes very close to this question of enabling environments. And you know, we just before this session, I was just with Archie at the site event, the official site event of the Commonwealth Secretariat, and there the Secretary General of the Commonwealth Secretariat argued that we need to work towards accelerating climate finance and accelerating the access to climate finance. And that in particular for most vulnerable countries, like the small island developing states. And here again, the question was, is the private sector there helping us? Is the private sector enabled to help us? So just, Gerrit, you've shown, of course, in your portfolio, it's mostly on the energy sector, but I was wondering, what sort of findings and what sort of takeaways have you gotten from the non-energy sector on enabling environments? What is it that we need to think about when thinking about the enabling environments for private sector?
Andreas, maybe if I can
Nathan.
come in on
Apologies, yeah, Nathan,
so,
please go ahead.
No worries, no worries. So maybe if I can come in and provide a little bit of a feedback on this, right? Because I think a number of great points have been made, you know, in all the presentations. Excellent. I completely agree. It's very important. Enabling environment that needs to be coordinated between the public and the private side for private sector to take hold. But let's take a step back, right? And I think, you know, based on the various presentations, we know the gap in climate financing is not in billions, it's in trillions, right? There has been references of $3 to $4 trillion of climate finance that's needed. So the issue is private sector not engaging in all kinds of contexts, not just in, you know, small island economies, but it's across the board in middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries, and even in developed economies. Private sector is not playing a big enough role for climate finance. So why is that happening, right? So let's take a step back. Private sector always has a dual objective, right? One is they got to make profits. They got to be self-sustaining, otherwise they don't have a business. So always they're looking to see if they can make profits. The other is they need to put on the other development hat and say, in this case, are they going to be value adding in terms of climate outcomes? Right. So as a result, you know, in comparison to the public operations, private sector is doing something a little bit more complicated. They're doing you know, two parallel things at the same time. So if we were to put ourselves in the private sector shoes, now I would highlight 4 or 5 things that are key considerations, constraints that private sector faces. Right. One is carbon pricing and carbon markets. See, right now, there is no unified approach for pricing carbon. Every region, every country, you know, or for different sectors, people are all using different price of carbon. And so carbon pricing has a key role to play in investment decision, because we all know that as part of you know, all IFI investments, we do economic return analysis. but we are not factoring in the price of carbon really well in any of these economic return analysis. And so we are all at fault in making investment decisions by not properly pricing in the price of carbon. And if private sector doesn't have clarity on the price of carbon, we can all understand why they don't want to get involved in an investment, because there is no opportunity for them to trade on the price of carbon, and there is no opportunity for them to make sure that during the course of the investment, whether the price of carbon will stay the same or whether it's going to widely fluctuate, right? So that I would identify as a key constraint, and I think that needs to be addressed. And I think there's been references to capacity building and technical assistance that can come into play in terms of coming up with a unified carbon market. The second thing that I would flag is, all the commercial players, right? They have taken it upon themselves now to, do the ESG reporting and in fact get rated based on their ESG responses, right? So private sector always had to get rated by the Moody's and the S&Ps of the world for their credit rating, right? And that's what affects their cost of borrowing. Now, increasingly with growing need for addressing climate, there is also a need for them to get rated based on ESG. But the problem is there is, again, no standard unified approach for ESG tracking or for reporting. And we went through the same thing for financial reporting, right? Some 30, 40 years ago, until the IFRS came about, whereas there's a unified reporting standard as far as accounting is concerned. We need to have the same thing for ESG. And there is a lot of work that's happening to come up with a unified reporting standard for ESG, but we are far from it. And I think that will greatly help private sector to have clarity, and that can be tied to their cost of borrowing, and that will force them to act on climate change, right? The third that I would flag as a key constraint for private sector is the incentive mechanisms, right? There has been references to blended finance, structures, and various mechanisms to attract the private sector. But at the end of the day, there are 3 or 4 key players in every transaction, right? One is an investor, one is the project sponsor, third is the project beneficiary. For a private sector transaction to succeed, you want to have all these 3 people win and have upsides, right? Because on the public side, people are not looking for upside. People are only trying to protect the downside. Whereas on the private sector side, everybody needs to have an upside. And so you need to come up with mechanisms and incentive mechanisms so that all 3 of them, based on their own accountability and performance, will have upside. And I think that is difficult to establish because policy regulatory environments come in the way of setting up a proper incentive mechanism, right? And the fourth thing that I will highlight is the short-term versus long-term nature of interventions of private sector that really holds them back, right? Look at what's happening now in the energy sector, right? The big oil and gas companies have been told that you need to cut back on your fossil fuel usage. So what they have been doing in the last couple of years to restructure themselves and go into accessing renewable sources of power, and they've been completely changing their business model, right? And so in the short term, they're coming through a lot of pain, right? Their profits are going to be hurt. Their capital investments are all going to be held back on fossil fuel assets, but they are going ahead with it because they say, they've been convinced that over the long term, this scenario that we are giving you is going to hold. But if that scenario, there is no stability in terms of a long-term scenario, private sector will never get involved because they're willing to take a pain in the short term in terms of profits. But there has to be clarity on the policy regulatory oversight enforcement function in each and every country in terms of the long-term scenario. Until then, private sector cannot engage in investments that go 10, 15 years, right? And I think these are all the key things that are holding back the private sector in all kinds of contexts. And it gets even harder in the fragile economies and small island countries, because as you can see, a number of the things that I laid out, those are even more complicated in the fragile economies and small island countries. But let me stop there, and I think I can come back to give you some examples of how private sector can be transformative later.
Thank you, Nathan, and apologies that I was not referring to you first. But thanks. This is, again, very insightful on seeing that there's 2 aspects that private sector needs to think about and is thinking about. This is the question of profits and profitability, as well as the value add that it will bring to the table. And it's also nicely linked to this question again on reporting and being able to bring forward the data that's needed for the private sector to take those decisions, and removing those information asymmetries that might be in the market. That brings me to this question of capacity. And that would be a question that I'd like to ask Archi about. And you know, we've been hearing about this, that countries are preparing themselves to truly access the Green Climate Fund and other funds, and thinking about what might be needed in order to unleash that potential in the countries as well. So not only from a financing perspective, but also bring the true private sector to the discussion and to the table. What sort of questions and what sort of constraints do we see with regards to capacity? Archi, what are we learning?
Andreas, when we did this evaluation, one of the questions we asked ourselves was what prevents countries from accessing the GCF, and especially for the private sector. Yeah, GCF is a very different institution from the other institutions that are on this panel, right? So the EBRD and the ADB are multilateral development banks, and the German government would be bilateral support. But the GCF has a very different mandate, where the countries are supposed to be in the driving seat of the decisions that get made and the projects that come from within the countries, yeah? So that's very important to remember. The other very important part of the GCF's mandate is direct access. It's expected that entities within the countries will be able to get accredited and then get access to the GCF resources through projects, and these will be in the countries. But what we find challenging is, especially for vulnerable countries, especially for countries with low capacity, there isn't enough capacity to A, plan for what might be the private sector related priorities, and B, then access the GCF. Right. So then we asked ourselves, what is the support provided by the GCF to make that happen? And GCF does have a program called the Readiness Program to do all of those things and other things. But the structural linkages of the Readiness Program with the private sector are still somewhat lacking. So the Readiness Program has about 14 different objectives, of which only 3 actually mention the private sector. And so it's a very limited support given through readiness to develop capacities in the countries on the private sector. Now, of the private sector, of the readiness grants that have been given to countries, there are about, there's very many. If you add them up, in all, they have about 3,000 outcomes. Every grant can have many different outcomes. There are about 3,000 or more. I might have the number somewhere here. 3,100 actually. Outcomes and all. And of those outcomes, only 400 something actually have private sector related outcomes. So that's very limited support given to the countries to support their capacity development or planning when it comes to the private sector. And that can strengthen a lot more, so that and we're making many recommendations related to this internal structures of the GCF Secretariat. And we're saying that the private sector facility of the GCF, which is a very specialized arm of the GCF, can have more structured linkages with the readiness program, which can then, in the medium term or the long term, support countries to develop their pipelines when it comes to the private sector.
No, excellent. Excellent to also highlight that the GCF is there to support, but it's struggling to be agile and relevant enough to truly think about the capacity. Look, I know we've been talking a lot. I also wanted to open up here to the audience that we have in the room here at the GCF Pavilion to just see if there's any striking questions that you'd like to ask the panelists. Yeah. Just state your name and the question.
Thank you for the talk. My name's Luke. I want to ask a question related to what was discussed earlier on about there being barriers for SIDS and LDCs and accessing Green Climate Fund. I'm wondering, are they similar or quite different barriers to the private sector?
Excellent, Luke. Barriers in the SIDS and LDCs, yes.
Thank you. My name is Ademola Ogunbanjo. I'm from Nigeria. The kind of scale that we're looking for cannot happen if we do not engage the private sector. This you already know. And because we're focusing on fragile economies and developing countries, essentially, capacity is an issue with the public sector. Therefore, the kind of energy or capacity that we require reside in the private sector. And as you have said in your report, the timeline of approving projects and accessing funds in the GCF, those timelines don't work with the private sector. Therefore, I would advise that in your support to the public sector in these fragile economies and developing countries, it is essential that you fast track, almost much more than you provide the funds, the framework through which you can actually engage the private sector directly, because what the private sector needs is to access the funds, and the public sector will still be there, perhaps to ratify the project, to ensure that those projects sit within a national agenda for climate-friendly infrastructure development. But the private sector must be able to reach out to GCF directly. Without that, the bureaucracy within local governments and the public sector in developing countries will discourage any engagement. And because of the economies of investment in climate-friendly infrastructure, not as profitable as other ventures, and currently the cost of funds that come from private commercial banks, right? It makes investing in these climate-friendly infrastructure unattractive to the private sector. And my last point, these fragile economies also have fluctuating foreign exchange regimes. So if I take a loan in dollars, because it's cheaper there, but I'm selling the service in my local currency, I take it in Nigeria, for example, the dollar today is 573 naira to a dollar. By the time I start paying back in 3 years' time, if present trends continue, it will probably be 1,000 to a dollar. So we also need to be able to access funds in the local currencies of these fragile economies for the private sector to meaningfully engage and for the gains we hope to see to happen.
No, thank you very much, dear colleague here from Nigeria. I noted down we have the question of scale and the question of capacity and the comment from capacity with the public is limited. We need the capacity from the private sector, but we need to fast track. We need to think about blended finance much more. A collaboration between markets, as well as the locality is key in borrowing as well. Any other question from the audience? I just wonder before I give it to the panel. I don't see anyone. That's okay. You please raise your hand if you have any. So look, coming to Luke and the barriers with the vulnerable countries, I'd like to give it back to Véronique just to hear a little bit on what we have learned in the synthesis study on this particular point, just to see are there differences in the barriers. That was exactly your question. So Véronique, I wonder if you can enlighten us a little bit of what we've learned with regards to the difference in the context and the difference in the barriers between different vulnerable groups, the SIDS, the LDCs, and others. Over to you.
I would say that actually, I would say that the barriers are quite similar. What differs is the intensity of the barriers. In a way, it's not that different from when you look at constraints to women in business and the barriers that they are facing. And it's really the intensity. Well, the type of barriers that could be different depending on the area and the type of countries would be, of course, the capacity of the public sector as one of the questions highlighted. Of course, some countries have less capacity and financial, but also human resources capacity and access to know-how to accompany the private sector. So that would be one of the key barriers. The second barrier is, again, usually the lack of maturity of the value chains and the lack of maturity of the business environment and of the policy. So I would say that usually, the difference is, I'm sorry, my voice is really getting bad now, but it's the same type of barriers. I would see if my colleagues have something else to add, but it's the same type of barriers. It's just a different level of constraints that the countries are facing. One element, and I will finish with that, is that it's important also to see in some countries that finance is less available than in others. So we talk about blended finance. Our IFIs are very much working towards mobilizing finance, and some countries are much more prone to being able to mobilize private sector finance than others. So I don't know if, I'm sorry, I can't continue, but I hope that I brought some information. Thank you.
Thanks, Veronique, and apologies, we won't ask you again. You seem getting worse throughout the night. But anyways, thank you so much for this. Look, just coming to this question again on blended finance and the fast tracking and the context of locality, and some may translate that as direct access. Archie, I'll ask you again, coming from the GCF and thinking about direct access quite a lot. What sort of lessons have we gained there? Perhaps also when we look at accreditation and the accreditation function here that guarantees direct access as well as international accredited access.
Right. Andreas, access and accreditation is very important to think about in the GCF, because that ultimately is the way to access the GCF. We're finding that it takes a very, very long time to get accredited. That's for sure. It takes over 700 days from the submission of application to actually getting approved by the board for accreditation, after which you can apply to get GCF resources. So that's one part. The other part is that the accreditation process itself may not be suitable to the character of private sector entities, because many of them are not designed to get finance from multilateral agencies. So that's one thing. The other part is related to the question on SIDS and LDCs and challenge of access in these countries, is that many entities, we've done an evaluation in the previous year, which Andreas and I co-led, on the portfolio of the GCF and the SIDS. And currently my unit is doing one on the portfolio of the GCF and the LDCs. And findings are quite similar, that the character of the private sector in some of these countries is not how it's understood in rooms such as this or in the GCF, because the formal economy is not that strong in some of these contexts. And for adaptation projects, it's important to consider those actors who might be a fisher person or someone selling fruit for everyday wages, right? So that's the private sector, or one hotel that actually runs the economy of the island. For that private sector to mobilize and to engage them in the GCF, it's important to consider a couple of things. One, many of the entities that do get accredited are so low in capacity. In our case studies, we found that many entities had ranging from 2 to 5 dedicated staff working on international climate finance. And that's sometimes actually smaller than the evaluation teams themselves. So they just don't have the capacity, once they get accredited, to develop more than one project, let alone run more than one project at the same time. Then the policies of the GCF are very often not suitable for many of these entities, and that's another challenge that we found as well. I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Excellent, excellent. And obviously a rich body of evidence that we've got there from the SIDS evaluation, also an evaluation report that's readily available on our website. Colleagues, before I ask for your closing remark on transformational change and paradigm shift, as we all, at least here at the GCF, think constantly about the transformative power of our actions and the question of how do we provide climate resilient and low emission development pathways in this climate space and create that paradigm shift that we all after. Before I ask for one sentence on your closing remark on what that may be, what is the element that would lead us to that transformational change, I'll go back very quickly and briefly on the blended finance aspect. And I know that DEval is thinking about blended finance a lot. I wonder if Sven, if you have some additional insights. You've talked about structured finance a lot. Any other things to share when we think about public-private capacities working together and blended finance at large? Over to you. I'll put you a little bit on the spot here, but you'll manage.
Yeah. Well, I guess your point, whether it be structured fund or any other types of funding, blended finance, local currency financing is definitely key. It is a challenge for some donors, but there are vehicles that do it. So in terms of blended finance, I think this is one important thing. Another one is keeping in mind the ticket size. We need to find investment opportunities that are on a scale large enough that it makes sense and that you can spread your risks. I think this is sort of a general finding from our evaluation as well. And I mean, Véronique also highlighted and also I think Archie and Nathan, the combination with technical assistance with TA, like dropping money on a country, on myself it might work, but maybe not if the size of the money. I mean, if you drop I don't know 10 billion euros on myself, I might get crazy. So I think just dropping money, investing large amounts without helping to and build the capacities, both with the investees, but also, and perhaps more importantly, with regulators, so that we can actually create a market. So I think that the groundwork before we start thinking about financing on regulation, for instance, in my experience, the important side of insurance. Making sure that we have appropriate regulations so that we can actually start creating a market with our investment. I think that's some important work for bilateral donors.
Excellent. Thanks, Sven. That's excellent. I actually forgot one question that I had parked previously, and that was one for Margaret. I forget. We were trying to think about the adaptation side a little bit more, and hearing from the GCF board and also the general negotiators here at COP, adaptation finance is important, and private sector in the adaptation finance has been not doing as well as we all hoped. I wanted to bring it back to you briefly to say, look, any type of learnings of what might be a solution to this question, or what sort of needs there might be from the private sector for adaptation. What can you share with us? And then maybe just asking you, starting with you here, the round of one key aspect for transformation, for transformational change and paradigm shift. What would it be that you think may be needed for the private sector?
Thank you so much, Andreas. So with regards to adaptation, we know it's hard and it's particularly difficult for the private sector because the business case just doesn't work there. So if the economics don't work, then the private sector just can't do that, and we can't find fault with the private sector for needing to make money that's what businesses do, otherwise they fail. And even if we were to give a grant to a business, for example, well, that doesn't mean that business model is working. So this is where it's this whole thing of adaptation. Interestingly, at the last board meeting, there were 3 private sector adaptation projects, which I can't remember ever seeing. 2 of those were very transformational, one for the blue economy and one for adaptation of technologies. And I think what both of those did was de-risking. So the GCF is coming in and de-risking. In one case, in one instance, is a first loss, and the other providing a buffer. So what we're seeing is that is creating this enabling environment. So I would say what we need more and more such solutions like that. So where public money is blended with private sector money in order to de-risk and help crowd in private investors. So that's one thing. And with regards to enabling, I think it was very interesting with the gentleman from Nigeria. And I'm sorry, I couldn't pronounce your name. You said it very quickly. Abdullah. Okay, brilliant. I think let's just put this into context very briefly with regards to the GCF, because it's so interesting what he's saying, and it makes perfect sense. However, at the GCF, you have to have country ownership, so you have to get a letter of no objection. And those are a bit like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. You know, it's a golden ticket, and it's hard to get. And I know a lot of accredited entities, they spend a lot of time trying to get this. So much time that is just burnt on top of trying to get, you know, your project approved or ready to go. So it's really this, for us to scale, I think there's a few things that we wanted. I know you said very quickly, but what it is you know, private sector specific guidance, prescriptive rather than general. That would really help. That would help, I think, all around this. The project-specific accreditation framework, that would help. Why? Because not everybody will want a portfolio. And to have people undergo 700 days to become something that they don't really want to do, but they want to do one project, you know, it's a bit of a shame that we're not able to do that, given that the fund is young, it's nimble. It should be nimble, but it's not. But operationalized in 2015, and you would think if this is the flagship you know, program that was designed back in Copenhagen or conceptualized back in Copenhagen, that surely we should be able to find a way to make it transformative. And then I guess the last point is, you know, this whole language. You look up paradigm shift or climate rationale, you know, go into Investopedia and you tell me that you're going to find it. You're not. So we've got to use these types of languages such that they're working both with the private sector as well. And, you know, I'm very hopeful. I'm very emphatic about this. This role that I do is voluntary, and it's voluntary and is really, really important that we crowd in, that we use every tool in the toolbox. And the private sector is, you know, desperate to all the ESG funds, all of these things, but we need to find a better pathway, and that really has to come, and I think the GCF can play that role. And I've talked enough. Thank you.
Excellent, Margaret. A better pathway. That is an excellent closing remark from you. I'll move it over to Archi. Archi, one aspect that you think will lead to this transformational change with private sector, even though we don't have a definition for transformational change yet.
And we don't have a definition for what constitutes the private sector portfolio, and that's another conversation that we need to have for the GCF, which is something we've not discussed at all. But just wanted to add a point to country ownership as well, and no objection letters. And we were finding also in this evaluation that multi-country projects are actually another dimension that we need to whole conversation about, especially for SIDS and LDCs, because that compromises in some cases the country ownership. But just coming back to the to transformational change and what constitutes that, interesting that Margaret mentions pathways, and we were talking about direction of travel, but I'll go back to the statement I made earlier, which is that how we travel and how we travel on that pathway is as important as the destination that we select for ourselves and for public institutions specifically, which have a very, very specific mandate. Claudia's in the room, and he led with him we counted at one point the number of mandates that the GCF has, and it's 18 different mandates. So the mandate is very, very specific, and how we travel on that pathway is as important as the destination.
Okay, Archie, how we travel and with whom? I move it over to Véronique. What do you think? One sentence, because we really have to close very soon. One sentence on what's needed for transformational change with the private sector.
Well, I would say what is needed is to have an approach that allows for innovation, that finances innovation, whether it's in research and development or in scaling up. I think it's also the capacity to test and fail. That's also the capacity to transfer know-how and knowledge from one country to another, from one sector to another. And this is the need really. What can be transformational is this collaboration that could be enhanced between public and private sector. and across the private sector. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. A lot that resonates with us, innovation and how we collaborate. I'll move it over to Nathan as the last one, and Sven, unfortunately, you won't be able to state anything. We really need to close very soon. Nathan, you have the final word, 1 minute.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Andreas. You know, on transformative changes, right? I agree with what Véronique had said. I think technology is going to be the solution that will help us address climate change at the end. And for this to happen effectively, I think the public side needs to incubate technology because they have a lot more access to research dollars and they can deploy it over a longer period of time. Individual private sector companies have very limited pocket in terms of how much they can put to come up with new technology. But the private sector is extremely efficient in commercializing new technology. So once the technology has been incubated and it's reached a stage where it can be made more viable in a larger scale, private sector can take it up. And we see demonstrations of this in various places, including in this mRNA vaccine, right? Where Pfizer and Moderna were able to come and take up all the research that has been there and commercialize it. And on climate change, there are huge areas, right, in terms of integrating renewable energy into the grid and how to optimize it better, storage systems, how to do carbon capture and storage. These and electrification of vehicles. These are all areas that need to clearly benefit from new technology. And in this, the public sector needs to do the incubation and the private sector could come in on a selective basis and commercialize it and then replicate it and mainstream it. And those will be highly transformative, I think, for the world and for all the economies. I'll stop there.
Excellent, Nathan. And collaboration hand in hand between public and private, public first, and commercialization with the private sector. Okay, we've got 1 minute, less than 1 minute, because people are still sitting here in the pavilion. Sven, your closing remark in less than one minute, please.
Absolutely, because I want to get my train. So for transformation, I think all donors need to make transformation the heart of their policies. Specifically, starting with my own country, Germany, transformation is still at the sidelines. There's no definition. Let's make that the heart of our bilateral cooperation, and then we might achieve something.
Okay, address the elephant in the room, so to speak. Thank you very much, esteemed colleagues and panelists, as well as thank you very much for the audience to stay longer, and 5 minutes longer. Excellent, thank you very much. Bye for now.